They say the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one shouting the loudest. It's the one who has stopped making noise entirely. Duke Adrian Blackthorne had built his empire on the silence of others, their fear, their deference, their swallowed rage. For 5 years he had mistaken his wife's quiet endurance for weakness, her composure for surrender, her patience for a woman too broken to fight back. He was wrong about all of it. The night he placed the blackthorn necklace around another woman's throat in front of the entire court, he didn't hear the sound of his wife weeping. He didn't hear her beg. He didn't hear anything at all. Because Seraphina Vale had already decided that some battles aren't won by fighting, they're won by leaving. Watch what happens when the woman a man spent 5 years destroying decides she's finally done being careful. As the Winter Masquerade Ball was the kind of event that separated the kingdom's pretenders from its players. Every chandelier in Blackthorne Hall had been lit for the occasion. 300 candles suspended above the great ballroom in cascading tiers of gold and amber, throwing warmth across a room that had never once felt warm to Seraphina Vale. The musicians had been imported from the capital's most fashionable conservatory. The wine came from cellars Adrian had spent a decade curating. The flowers, white roses and winter jasmine interwoven with sprigs of frosted holly, had been arranged by a team of florists who'd worked through the previous night to meet her husband's exacting standards. Everything in that room had been chosen by Adrian Blackthorne. Everything in that room existed to reflect his taste, his wealth, his power, including, for 5 years, his wife. Seraphina stood near the east archway with a crystal glass of Rhenish wine she had no intention of drinking, watching the room with the particular attention of someone who had long ago learned that observation was the only real currency a woman in her position possessed. She wore deep midnight blue, not black, which would have read as mourning, and not the ivory Adrian preferred her in because it made her look, as he once said, appropriately soft. The midnight blue had been her own choice, and she'd made it 3 weeks ago when she commissioned the gown from a dressmaker in the city's merchant quarter, rather than the court seamstress who reported back to Adrian's household steward. Small rebellions. A woman learned to traffic in them. Her mask was silver-threaded silk, shaped like winter frost, and it covered enough of her face to give her the gift of watching without being watched in return. She was very good at that gift by now. The room moved the way power always moved, in currents, in orbits, in the magnetic pull of bodies toward influence and away from disgrace. She tracked it automatically, a skill built across 5 years of navigating a marriage that required the constant geopolitical awareness of a woman who understood she was always one wrong conversation away from something worse. Lord Pemberley stood near the central fountain with 2 of the younger viscounts, laughing too loudly at something that probably wasn't funny. Lady Ashworth had positioned herself strategically beside the Dowager Countess of Mirefort, whose favor could open or close half the doors in the eastern province. Ambassador Delacroix from the southern territories moved through the room with the careful, measured confidence of a man who was always simultaneously a guest and a spy. And Adrian. Adrian was holding court near the fireplace, which is where he always positioned himself at these events. The physical warmth at his back creating the unconscious impression of radiant power, a trick he had not invented but had certainly mastered. He was dressed in blackthorn charcoal and silver, his dark hair swept back in the style that the fashion pages had been breathlessly crediting him with popularizing for the past 2 seasons. He was 34 years old and looked like a man who had been engineered specifically to make other men feel inadequate and women feel chosen. He had that quality, that gravitational wrongness about him where cruelty read as strength and dismissal read as discernment, and the simple fact of his attention felt like something worth earning. Seraphina had once been completely undone by it. She remembered that version of herself with something that was no longer quite grief and not yet quite pity. A girl of 19 who had arrived at Blackthorne Hall, believing with the full sincere idiocy of someone who had been raised on the romantic literature her mother favored, that a difficult man was simply a man waiting for the right love to soften him. 5 years of marriage had been thorough in its education. She found him in the crowd not because she was searching for him. She had stopped searching for Adrian Blackthorne in rooms approximately 2 years ago, but because the room itself organized around him, and tracking Adrian's position had become as automatic and survival-oriented as tracking weather. He was talking to Cecily Harmon, Of course, he was talking to Cecily Harmon. Seraphina processed this information with the same flat interior acknowledgement she brought to all the information about her husband that the household staff, with their various loyalties and their own forms of self-preservation, delivered to her in sideways fragments. Cecily Harmon was 22, the younger daughter of a minor lord with more ambition than land, and she had been Adrian's mistress for the better part of 8 months. Seraphina knew the timeline with precision because she had made it her business to know. Not from jealousy, that particular pain had a half-life, and she had outlasted it, but because information about Adrian's vulnerabilities was the only form of security she had managed to build in a marriage where she had been given no other tools. What she did not know, what no amount of careful household intelligence had prepared her for, was what happened next. She watched Adrian reach into the interior pocket of his coat. She watched him produce something small, something that caught the candlelight in a particular way that made the air leave her chest before her mind had fully processed why. She watched him smile at Cecily Harmon with the particular private warmth he had never once directed at his wife in public. The smile that said, "You matter," the smile that said, "I chose you." And she watched him lift the necklace from its velvet backing and hold it out. And she watched Cecily turn and lift her hair with the practiced ease of a woman who had known this was coming. And she watched Adrian Blackthorne fasten the Blackthorne family necklace around the throat of a woman who was not his wife. The Blackthorne necklace. Seraphina's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass. The necklace was not merely jewelry. In a house like Blackthorne, a house with the kind of history that turned objects into symbols and symbols into instruments of control, the necklace occupied a specific social grammar that every person in that room over the age of 25 understood fluently. It had been given to the first Duchess of Blackthorne by the king of 3 generations past. It passed through the female line of the ducal house as a declaration of belonging, of legitimacy, of a woman standing in the family. It was the piece Adrian's mother had worn to every court function until her death. It was the piece Seraphina had worn exactly twice, once at their wedding, once at the formal presentation of the household to the crown, before Adrian had removed it from the family vault and told her, with the gentle impersonal cruelty that was his particular genius, that he preferred to keep it for special occasions. She had understood what that meant even then. She had simply chosen, in the relentless pragmatic calculus of her survival, to understand it quietly and alone. But this was not quiet, and she was not alone. The room of 300 people, the room of Lord Pemberley and Lady Ashworth and Ambassador Delacroix, the room of people who had been watching the Blackthorne marriage with the particular attentive sympathy of observers who are grateful not to be the subject. That room had gone very slightly still, in the way that rooms did when something significant was happening and everyone present was trying to calculate how visibly to react. Seraphina set her wine glass down on the tray of a passing footman with an absolutely steady hand. She reached into the small silver evening bag she carried, the one with the Blackthorne crest embossed on the clasp, a detail she had always found somewhat grim, and she removed her wedding ring. She had taken it off once before, for a jeweler who was repairing a loose stone. The sensation of its absence on her finger had been disorienting in a way that embarrassed her in retrospect, that her body had learned to register the weight of an obligation she had never wanted as a kind of comfort. The finger knew the ring. The ring had been there for 5 years. Taking it off felt, that one time in the jeweler's shop, like touching a bruise. Tonight it felt like nothing. She walked to the fireplace. The crowd parted in the way crowds parted for Seraphina, not with the electric deference they offered Adrian, but with the quieter, more complicated respect they gave a woman they collectively understood to be in a position that made them uncomfortable to contemplate. She was used to that particular species of invisible pity. She had worn it for 5 years the way she wore everything Adrian had given her, with impeccable composure and a private interior that no one in this room had ever actually been invited into. Adrian noticed her approach the way he always noticed her approach, late and with a slight recalibration of his expression that was so practiced as to be nearly imperceptible. Cecily Harmon noticed her approximately 1 second before Adrian did and performed the brief full-body adjustment of a woman who has thought about this specific scenario and is not as prepared for it as she believed. Seraphina did not look at Cecily Harmon. She looked at her husband. She placed the wedding ring beside his wineglass on the mantelpiece. The sound it made, that small, precise click of gold on marble, was not loud. It carried anyway. Then she turned and walked toward the east archway. She did not look back. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice or make a scene or give the room a single thing they could quote in the days that followed beyond this. The Duchess of Blackthorne left her wedding ring beside her husband's wineglass and walked out of the winter masquerade before midnight without saying a single word. The carriage was already waiting. She had arranged that 3 days ago. Chit. Later, much later, in a different season and a different version of her life, Seraphina would try to explain to her cousin Marin why the silence had mattered more than anything she could have said. "You could have destroyed him right there," Marin said. Marin was the kind of woman who had opinions about what other women should do, delivered with the comfortable certainty of someone who had never been in the position that required those decisions. 300 witnesses, the necklace. I could have given him a scene, Seraphina said. That's all. A scene that would have been about him, about his behavior, his response, his control of the narrative. A woman weeping in front of 300 people stops being a person and becomes a cautionary tale. I was done being his cautionary tale. So you just left. I made him explain my absence. For the rest of his life, in every conversation about that night, he has to answer for what I did without giving him anything to answer with. There's no quote. There's no accusation. There's only the ring on the mantelpiece and the door I walked through. She paused. Silence is the only thing a man like that can't control. Masset. The estate at Valawick sat 40 miles south of the capital, in a fold of land between the river and the long forested hills, where the sky in winter went a particular shade of gray-violet that Seraphina had always found more honest than anything in Blackthorne Hall. Her grandmother had left it to her directly, with the specific legal architecture of a woman who had understood her granddaughter's marriage clearly and had spent the last years of her life making certain that one piece of the world could never be taken from Seraphina by the man she had been given to. The estate was small by ducal standards. Modest house, working farmland, a vineyard that had fallen into disrepair over the decade of her grandmother's illness, a handful of staff who had stayed on wages that were barely adequate because they were loyal to the memory of the woman who had paid them with more than money. Seraphina arrived at 2 a.m, still wearing the midnight blue gown, the silver mask hanging from her fingers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elspeth Crane, met her at the door with a lamp and the particular expression of a woman who had been expecting exactly this and had been quietly furious on Seraphina's behalf for longer than she would say. "Your room is ready," Mrs. Crane said. "I've had it ready for 6 months." Seraphina looked at her. That obvious? Only to people paying attention. The old woman stepped back to let her in. "There's soup if you want it. It's cold enough tonight." "I want it," Seraphina said. It was the first thing she had wanted in a long time that she had simply said out loud without calculating what it would cost her. She sat in the kitchen of her grandmother's house in a midnight blue gown that had cost more than most people in that village earned in a year, and she ate soup that Mrs. Crane had made from the kitchen garden, and she did not cry. Not because she was performing composure for an audience that no longer existed, but because the grief had been processed in private increments over 5 years until there was very little left of it. What she felt sitting in that kitchen was not the sharp pain of fresh loss. It was something quieter, the specific bodily exhaustion of a person who has been maintaining a performance for an extremely long duration and has finally put it down. "I'm going to need the land records," she said when the soup was half gone. "The vineyard assessments. Whatever state the accounts are in, all of it." Mrs. Crane, who had been watching her with the steady evaluating care of someone who had known her since childhood, nodded once. "I'll have them on your desk by morning," she said. But the legal dissolution of the marriage did not move quickly. Nothing in the ducal legal system moved quickly, which was partly a feature of institutional process, and partly a feature of the fact that the institutional process had been designed by men who assumed that women requesting dissolution of marriages were making emotional decisions that time and careful discouragement would correct. What those men did not account for was Seraphina's solicitor, a quiet, methodical woman named Clara Holt, who had built her practice on the theory that the law read differently when you understood every word of it, and who had been waiting for exactly this commission for approximately 3 years. "He'll dispute the grounds," Claire told her, in the small office above the Merchants' Guild Hall in the nearest town, 3 weeks after the masquerade. "His solicitors are already communicating. The public acknowledgement is useful, but he'll argue that a single incident of poor judgment—" "There are 5 years of incidents," Seraphina said. "I have documentation of 47 of them." Clara Holt stopped writing. "Financial, social, and otherwise," Seraphina continued. "Dates, witnesses, correspondence. The letters he sent to the Harmon woman that I intercepted through the household mail. The account transfers. The household funds redirected to her maintenance. I've been keeping records since the 2nd year of the marriage." "Why did you wait?" Clara asked. Not with judgment, with the genuine curiosity of a professional trying to understand her client. Seraphina thought about it. The real answer, not the answer she would give to someone who needed a simplified version. "Because leaving with nothing would have been leaving on his terms," she said finally. "I needed to leave with something he couldn't take back. I needed to leave when I had built enough that walking away from Blackthorne wasn't falling. It was just moving." Yes. The vineyard had not been entirely destroyed by the decade of neglect. That was the first thing Seraphina learned when she walked it in the thin winter light, accompanied by the estate's remaining groundskeeper, a weathered man named Thomas, who spoke in the deliberate way of someone who had been around long enough to understand that most problems that looked fatal were actually just expensive. "The rootstock is sound," Thomas said, crouching beside a row of dormant vines, his fingers working at the soil with the automatic intimacy of someone who had spent decades in this specific relationship. "This variety, it's old, predates your grandmother by 2-3 generations. Doesn't die easy." "What does it need?" Seraphina asked. "Time, good pruning, someone paying attention." He stood, brushing the earth from his hands. "Money wouldn't hurt." "I have money," she said, which was technically true in the same way that having a knife was technically useful. True, but not quite sufficient for what she was planning to do with it. She had her grandmother's inheritance, which was modest but real. She had the jewelry she had worn out of Blackthorne Hall, which she had immediately inventoried and separated into categories. Pieces that were personal gifts from Adrian that she found repellent and would sell without sentiment. Pieces that had belonged to her own family, and that she was keeping regardless of what they were worth, and the Blackthorne pieces which she had already had legally assessed and documented against the day when Adrian's solicitors would inevitably claim she'd left with property that wasn't hers. She had also, in the 2 weeks between the masquerade and her departure, conducted a careful review of every financial arrangement that touched her own name. Her grandmother's estate had been structured outside the marital assets. The small investment her own father had made in her name at her birth, which Adrian had been aware of but had never bothered to investigate because it was too small to be interesting to a man of his scale, had been sitting in a merchant bank for 24 years accumulating the particular patience of money that no one is bothering. It wasn't a fortune. It was a foundation. There was a difference, and she understood it. "I want to expand the vineyard," she told Thomas. "I want to reclaim the North Field and replant it. I want to hire 2 additional workers for the spring. And I want you to tell me honestly what else on this estate is currently losing money that could, with investment, become something different." Thomas looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating expression of a man who was deciding whether the person in front of him was serious or performing seriousness. "That's a long list," he said. "I have time," she said, pausing. What followed was not the montage that the court imagined, the dramatic transformation, the sudden flowering of a broken woman into a phoenix, the satisfying narrative of revenge assembled in a convenient time frame. What followed was work. Hard, tedious, unglamorous work that smelled like soil and accounting ink, and the particular mildew of records that had not been properly maintained. Seraphina learned the accounts herself, rather than delegating entirely to an estate manager she hadn't yet built reason to trust. She learned them the way she had learned everything useful in her life, by treating ignorance not as a condition to be embarrassed about, but as a problem with a solution that required her direct attention. She sat with Thomas for 3 hours a day in the first week, going through every line of the estate's operations, asking questions that revealed her inexperience with frank unself-consciousness, because she had learned long ago that false expertise was a more expensive vanity than honest ignorance. The vineyard was the obvious anchor, but Thomas had been right that the list was long. The tenant farmland to the west had been underleased for years at rates that made no economic sense. The mill on the eastern edge of the property had been sitting idle since a flood 3 years prior had damaged the wheel mechanism, and Thomas had been submitting repair estimates to the estate's absentee management that had been filed and ignored. The manor house itself was structurally sound, but had not been properly maintained and contained several rooms that were currently unusable due to roof damage from the previous winter. "What's the mill worth if it's running?" Seraphina asked, standing in the cold stone interior of the building with Thomas beside her, both of them looking up at the damaged mechanism with their breath misting in the January air. "To the tenants?" "Essential. They're paying milling fees to a merchant 3 miles east right now." He paused. "To you? The income is modest, but it's reliable. People always have grain." She commissioned the repairs the following week. She had the tenant leases reviewed and renegotiated, not dramatically, not in a way that created hardship, but accurately, which created a meaningful improvement in the estate's monthly numbers. She wrote letters, dozens of letters, in the first weeks, because the estate's commercial relationships had also atrophied, and rebuilding them required the particular patience of correspondence, the careful maintenance of contact with merchants and buyers and neighboring landowners who needed to be reminded that Valuwick was under active management. She wrote in her own hand, in the precise, clear penmanship her governess had spent years drilling into her, and she signed them without title because she was, technically, in the middle of a legal dissolution and the title was contested. She signed them Seraphina Vale, her grandmother's name, her own name recovered. In the evenings she read, not the ornamental reading she had performed in Blackthorne Hall, the novels and poetry that Adrian had implicitly approved as appropriately feminine occupations, but the books she had always wanted to read and hadn't because they would have required explanation. Agricultural texts, commercial law, the histories of the kingdom's great trading families, read not as social history, but as instruction in how wealth was built and maintained by people who had started with less than she had now. She did not write to Adrian. He wrote to her 3 times in the first 2 months. The first letter was cold and formal, conveying through his solicitors that he expected her return. The second was warmer and personally signed, in the handwriting she had once found compelling, expressing regret in the general way of a man who understood that regret was strategically necessary without having identified specifically what he regretted. The third was a single paragraph that said, stripped of its elaborate court language, "I did not think you would actually go." She handed all 3 to Clara Holt and never read them again. 1. Spring arrived at Valuwick the way spring arrived in the hill country. Not with the dramatic sudden warmth of the lowlands, but with a gradual, grudging, deeply convincing accumulation of evidence. First the crocuses at the edge of the kitchen garden, pushing through ground that still held frost. Then the particular quality of the morning light, changing by increments until one day she stepped outside and understood without consciously deciding that the season had changed. The vineyard work began in March. Thomas had hired the 2 additional workers she'd approved. Brothers from the village, solid and competent and unsettled, in the way of people who had heard fragmentary and conflicting accounts of who had returned to the Vale estate and why. Seraphina resolved the uncertainty by appearing in the vineyard on the second morning, asking competent questions about the pruning schedule, and treating them with the matter-of-fact practical respect of a person who valued work and had no time for performance. They settled. She was not soft about the work, and she was not performing hardness either. She had shed, somewhere in the first weeks at Valuwick, the exhausting dual burden of the Blackthorne marriage, the requirement to be simultaneously impressive enough for Adrian's public pride and deferential enough for his private comfort. It had been a more constricting prison than she had fully understood while she was inside it, because the parameters had been enforced so consistently and for so long that she had stopped noticing them the way you stopped noticing a piece of furniture that had always been in the same corner. Without it, she discovered she was considerably more direct than she had been permitted to be. She said what she observed. She disagreed when she disagreed. She made decisions and communicated them without the layer of gentle hedging she had learned to apply to every opinion that might otherwise read as challenge. "You're different than I expected," Thomas said one afternoon in early April. They were walking the north field, which had been cleared and was being prepared for replanting. The work looked brutal up close, the ground still raw, the new stakes stark against the pale sky. But Thomas walked it with something that read almost like satisfaction. "Different how?" she asked. He thought about it. The other great houses. When a woman from one of them comes to manage a property, there's usually a period where they're managing the property the way they think it should look from a distance. Orders that make sense on paper. Staff who spend half their time translating the orders into what actually works. He looked at the field rather than at her. "You came in and looked at what was actually here." "I had to," she said. "I didn't have the luxury of being wrong." She had been thinking about that. The luxury of being wrong in ways she hadn't had language for during the marriage. Adrian had always had the luxury of being wrong. His wrongness had consequences for the people around him and not, in any practical material sense, for himself. He had been wrong about the Harmon investment that had cost House Blackthorne a significant amount of money the year prior. He had been wrong about the northern tenant dispute that had ended in court proceedings he lost. He had been wrong about her. But being wrong had never cost him his position, his resources, his fundamental sense of himself as a man whose judgment was sound. Seraphina had never had that protection. She had been required, from the moment she crossed the threshold of Blackthorne Hall at 19, to be right. About her behavior, her presentation, her management of the household, her navigation of court politics, her performance of the elaborate fiction that her marriage was a dignified alliance between two people of compatible temperament. She had been required to be right in a way that was invisible, that produced no credit when it succeeded and catastrophic social consequences when it failed. She had been right for 5 years. She had been right and exhausted and completely alone with her rightness. Here, the rightness was hers. The consequences were hers. The land she was gradually learning was hers, under her feet, responsive to her attention in the specific immediate way that land was, not the abstract influence that court maneuvering produced, which was real but invisible and always contingent on a dozen other people's decisions, but the physical concrete responsiveness of ground that produced crops when it was cared for and produced nothing when it wasn't. She found something in that she didn't have a word for yet. The letter from the Capitol arrived in late April. It came through Clara Holt, who forwarded it with a brief note that said only, "You'll want to read this one carefully." It was from Lady Maren Ashworth, not Seraphina's cousin, but a different Ashworth, a woman she had always found formidable and somewhat frightening in the court context, a woman who had survived 2 difficult marriages and 3 changes of regime and was now one of the 3 or 4 people whose opinion shaped the actual social landscape of the court rather than merely reflecting it. The letter was short. "You are being talked about," it said. "I want you to know that the talk is not what you might fear. There is a version of what happened at the masquerade that makes you pitiable. That version is not circulating. The version that is circulating is the ring on the mantelpiece and the door you walk through, and I have heard it described in 3 separate conversations this week with an admiration that I think would surprise you. Come to court when you are ready, come prepared, and come as yourself." Sir Ashworth Seraphina read it twice, folded it, set it on the corner of her desk, and looked at it for a long time. She was not ready for court. She knew that with the certainty of someone who had learned to read her own state of readiness accurately, not the performed readiness she'd practiced for 5 years, but the actual internal sense of whether the ground was solid enough to move from. The ground at Valwick was becoming solid. The vineyard was planted. The mill was repaired and running. The accounts were legible and trending correctly. Clara Holt had informed her that the dissolution proceedings were progressing with a momentum that Adrian's solicitors were struggling to slow, partly because the documentation Seraphina had assembled was comprehensive, and partly because the political wind had shifted slightly in the weeks since the masquerade in ways that made Adrian's position less impregnable than he was accustomed to. She was not ready for court, but she was, for the first time in 5 years, building something that would make her ready. She wrote back to Lady Ashworth the following morning. "Thank you for the intelligence and for the kindness of how you've shared it. I will be ready before the summer season ends. When I return, I intend to return as something the court has not seen before. I would be grateful for your counsel when the time comes." She sealed it with the Valowick crest, her grandmother's crest, the silver fox on a field of blue, and sent it without the Blackthorne seal for the first time in 5 years. The summer at Valowick was the best summer she could remember having. She was busy in a way that felt the opposite of the performative busyness of court life, not the endless social obligation that dressed itself up as consequence, but the actual labor of building something. The vineyard showed its first season of recovery. The north field had been successfully planted. The mill was running and had already justified its repair costs. 3 of the tenant families had come to her directly, in the careful, tentative way of people who had learned not to expect much from their landlords, to discuss situations that the previous management had left in holding patterns for years. She resolved all 3 in the course of a single afternoon. 2 required decisions, 1 required money. None of them required more than the willingness to actually look at the situation rather than manage the appearance of looking at it. "You could hire a steward to do this," Mrs. Crane observed one evening, in the tone of someone who was not actually suggesting she do it. "I could," Seraphina agreed, "but then I wouldn't know whether the steward was doing it correctly." "And if you hire a good steward?" "Then I would be trusting the steward's assessment of their own performance." She looked at the old woman. "I've spent 5 years trusting someone else's assessment of a situation I could see with my own eyes. I'm not in a hurry to do that again." Mrs. Crane said nothing. She had, in Seraphina's experience, a talent for silences that communicated complete understanding without requiring words. It was a quality Seraphina had come to appreciate with the specific depth of appreciation reserved for things you had long been starved of. In August, she went back to the jeweler in town, not the Blackthorne-affiliated court jeweler, but the independent one who had a reputation for discretion and honest appraisal, and had the pieces she'd decided to sell assessed. The sum was larger than she'd expected. She put half into the estate and the other half into the account Clara Holt had established as the foundation for what Seraphina was beginning, cautiously, to think of as the next thing. She had not identified the next thing yet with precision. She knew it involved commerce, the trading relationships that were beginning to develop out of the vineyard's recovery, the conversation she'd been having with the merchants who came through the valley, the particular understanding she was developing of where goods were being undervalued and where they were being overpriced and why. She knew it involved the capital, eventually. She knew it involved the court and Lady Ashworth's counsel, and the particular reputation that the ring on the mantelpiece had apparently earned her. She was patient. She had learned, in 5 years of marriage to a man who weaponized impatience, that patience was not weakness. It was the accumulation of conditions that made the right action inevitable. In September, Adrian came to Valowick. She had expected this eventually. Claire Holt had warned her that once the dissolution proceedings reached a certain stage of seriousness, Adrian would shift tactics from legal obstruction to personal intervention, because personal intervention had always been his most effective instrument. He was genuinely compelling in person. She had never deceived herself about that. Whatever he had failed to be as a husband, he was a man who understood how to make other people feel the full weight of his attention, and the full weight of his attention had always been the original thing that had made her believe, at 19, that the difficult man might be reachable. He arrived on a Tuesday morning without advance notice, which was either a deliberate tactical choice designed to prevent her from preparing, or the unexamined assumption of a man accustomed to his arrival being its own sufficient announcement. She was in the vineyard when Thomas came to find her. "Duke Blackthorne at the gate," Thomas said, with the studied neutrality of a man who had views about this visitor and was keeping them in reserve. "Tell him I'll be 20 minutes, she said. She finished what she was doing. She washed her hands at the pump by the barn. She walked back to the house and changed out of her work clothes into a simple dress that was clean and presentable and had nothing to do with Adrian. Not the kind of thing she would have worn at Blackthorne Hall, not an attempt to impress him, not a performance of the indifference she actually felt. She looked at herself briefly in the mirror above the washstand, a woman who had spent the summer outdoors, whose hands were no longer the careful ornamental hands of a duchess, but the competent hands of someone who worked. She looked, she thought, like herself. She had him shown into the drawing room. Not the formal receiving room, which would have implied a kind of official weight she didn't want to grant the meeting, but not the kitchen either. The drawing room that had been her grandmother's favorite, with the windows that looked out onto the kitchen garden and the hills beyond. He was standing when she came in. Of course he was standing. Adrian never sat first in a room, another of those small tactical performances so habitual they were probably unconscious by now. He looked like he always looked, exact and controlled and carefully assembled. He also looked, she noticed with the flat observational accuracy she had been cultivating, slightly less certain than she was accustomed to seeing him. "Seraphina," he said. "Adrian," she said. She moved to the chair near the window, the chair her grandmother had sat in, and she sat in it without inviting him to sit, a small reversal of the domestic grammar he had always controlled. She watched him notice it. He sat anyway, across from her, in the chair that had always been for guests. The situation had a different geometry than any room they'd shared at Blackthorne Hall, and she thought he felt it. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. The silence that followed was the kind she had learned to tolerate while he assembled his approach. Adrian always thought before he spoke in significant conversations, not hesitation but calculation, the deliberate construction of the framing that would be most effective. She had once mistaken this for depth. "I didn't come to argue about the proceedings," he said. "All right. I came because—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that was not quite what she expected, not the performance of regret she had anticipated, the strategic softness that had occasionally worked on her in the first years of the marriage, when she had still been hopeful enough to interpret effort as feeling. This was something else, something less constructed. "I came because I want to understand what happened." "Which part?" she asked. "All of it." He looked at her with the specific directed attention she had once wanted so badly and now found simply legible. 5 years. I want to understand, was there a point where it could have been different? Was there something I could have— Adrian? Her voice was quiet, entirely steady. You want to understand what happened the way a man wants to understand a strategy that didn't work. You want to find the decision point, the variable, the thing that if you'd done differently would have produced a different outcome. She watched his face. That's not the same thing as wanting to understand what happened to me. He was quiet. There were 100 moments, she said. 100 places where a different choice would have built a different marriage. I stopped counting them around the end of the second year because counting them was costing me more than the marriage was worth. She looked at him. At the man she had married, the man she had tried to reach for 5 years, the man she had finally, irrevocably stopped trying to reach. I don't hate you. I want you to understand that. What I feel about you now is much more boring than hatred. It's just nothing. You asked me once, early in the marriage, what I wanted. Do you remember? He didn't answer immediately. I remember. You asked as a performance, she said, because it was the right kind of thing to ask a new wife and you had learned to produce the right performances at the right times. You didn't actually want to know the answer. She paused. I answered you honestly. Do you remember what I said? The silence stretched. No, he admitted, and she believed him. I said I wanted to be in a room with someone who was actually interested in whether I was in the room. She looked out at the kitchen garden, at the hills. I built that room here. It took me 5 years, but I built it. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Blackthorne, most powerful nobleman in the kingdom, a man who had never knelt before anyone in his adult life, sat in the guest chair in her grandmother's drawing room and looked at his wife, and for the first time in 5 years of marriage, she saw something that was not calculation in his face. It was too late. She needed him to understand that, and she thought he was beginning to. The proceedings will be finalized, she said. Clara Holt is thorough. Your solicitors know it. She stood because the conversation had reached its natural end, and she was no longer in the habit of extending interactions past their usefulness. You should go back to the capital, Adrian. You have a house to manage. I have a vineyard. He stood. The trained reflexes of courtesy. He had always had those, even when he had nothing else that resembled kindness. If you ever needed anything, he started. I'll handle it, she said. She walked him to the door herself. She watched the Blackthorne carriage turn on the estate drive and disappear down the road toward the Capitol. She stood on the step until the sound of it faded, and then she went back inside and poured herself a cup of tea from the pot Mrs. Crane had quietly placed on the kitchen table, and she sat in the warm kitchen of her grandmother's house, and she thought about the fall. The harvest would be in 6 weeks. The first real harvest of the recovered vineyard. Modest, Thomas had cautioned her, because the vines needed another season to reach full capacity, but real. Evidence. The beginning of the thing that the next years would become. She would go to court in October. Lady Ashworth had confirmed the invitation. She had already begun to think about what she would bring with her and what she would leave behind. What she would leave behind, the ring, already left. The name she had been required to perform under. The silence she had maintained not as strength but as survival. What she would bring. The silence she had chosen. The woman who had been right for 5 years in the dark and had finally turned a light on. The particular quality of attention she had developed. The ability to look at what was actually in front of her without fear and without need and see it clearly. She was going back to the court that had watched her for 5 years with that uncomfortable, sympathetic pity. She was going back as something the pity no longer fit. She finished her tea and went to her desk. There were letters to write. There were accounts to review. There was a trading arrangement she'd been developing with a merchant family in the capital's southern quarter that was almost ready to formalize, an arrangement that was small in itself, but that Clara Holt had identified as the potential first link in a commercial chain that could, if Seraphina was patient and accurate about it, become something significant. She picked up her pen. She had barely written the first line when Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway with an expression that Seraphina had learned to read over the past months, as the precursor to news the old woman found alarming, but was determined to deliver without alarming her. "There's a writer," Mrs. Crane said. "He came from the capital. He's asking for you specifically. He says—" She paused. "He says he has a message from the Royal Council about House Blackthorne." Seraphina set down her pen. "Send him in," she said. The writer was young, breathless, with the urgency of a man who had ridden hard and understood he was carrying something significant. He handed her the sealed envelope with a slightly trembling hand and stood back while she opened it. She read it once. Then she read it again. The blood in her veins went very still. Adrian's mistress had not simply been stealing. The letter was careful and formal and written in the precise language of official Royal Council communication, but stripped to its bones it said this: Cecily Harmon had been operating as an intelligence asset for a foreign power. She had done so using the access, the correspondence, and the documented authority of the Duke of Blackthorne. The operation had been running for the better part of a year. The Crown had become aware of it 48 hours ago. The full scope of the network was still being assessed. House Blackthorne was under immediate investigation. And at the bottom of the letter, in a different hand, in the hand that Seraphina recognized, with a cold drop in her stomach, as belonging to one of the 3 or 4 members of the Royal Council who were her husband's actual enemies rather than his political competitors, was a single additional line. Certain evidence in the matter of the network's operations has been traced to correspondence that may have originated from the Duchess of Blackthorne. We will require your cooperation. The room was very quiet. Seraphina Vale looked at the letter in her hands, the letter that had just made her, in the space of a single sentence, not a woman building a new life in the countryside, but a figure in a political catastrophe that someone had very deliberately constructed in a way that left her inside the blast radius. She thought about the letters, the one she'd sent from Vallowick to the capital, the correspondence she'd maintained with the trading contacts, the letters she'd sent to Clara Holt, the ones she'd sent to Lady Ashworth. And then she thought about the letter she'd received from Lady Ashworth in April. The one that had told her the version of events circulating at court was not the one that made her pitiable. Someone had been building a version of events, and it occurred to her, with the cold geometric clarity of someone who had spent 5 years in a household where information was a weapon, that the version designed to make her look powerful might have been constructed specifically to make it plausible that she could be dangerous. "Madam?" the writer asked. "The council requires a response." She folded the letter. She looked at the young man with the same expression she had worn the night she placed her wedding ring on a mantelpiece. The expression of someone who has understood exactly how bad a situation is and has declined to let the situation's badness determine what she does next. "Tell the council," she said, "that I will attend them." She paused. "And tell them," she added very quietly, "that they should prepare for a longer conversation than they are expecting." The royal council chamber smelled like old stone and older power. Seraphina had been in the room twice before. Once at the formal presentation of the Blackthorne household succession documents 2 years into the marriage. Once during a brief ceremonial function that had required the Duke's wife to stand in a specific position for a specific duration and then remove herself. Both times she had entered as an extension of Adrian Blackthorne, a face attached to a title attached to a man. She entered now alone, with Clara Holt 2 steps behind her and the full documentation case tucked under Clara's arm, and she registered the chamber with the particular quality of attention she had been building all year, the kind that looked at what was actually present rather than what was supposed to be there. 7 counselors. 3 she recognized as Adrian's functional allies, men whose political fortunes had been entangled with Blackthorne influence long enough that their loyalty had the calcified quality of something that had stopped being a choice. 2 were genuinely neutral, bureaucratic survivors who had served 3 different administrations by being useful and unremarkable. 1 was Lord Cassian Vere, who had written that final line on the council's letter, and whose precise, watchful face now tracked her entry with the expression of a man examining the variables of a situation he believed he controlled. The 7th seat was empty. She noted the empty seat and filed it. "Lady Seraphina," Vere said. He had the voice of a man who had spent decades using civility as a blade. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "Lord Vere." She sat without being invited to, across the table from him, in the chair that placed her equidistant from all 7 positions. The geometry was deliberate. Clara took the chair to her left. "I'd like to understand the nature of the allegation before we discuss my cooperation." "Of course." Vere's hands were flat on the table, relaxed, a man performing relaxation. "The council's investigation has identified a correspondence network operating out of House Blackthorne over the past 14 months. The network appears to have been used to transmit sensitive Crown information to agents of the Delacroix faction in the Southern Territories." He paused, and in the pause she heard the trap being assembled. Several letters within the network bear authentication marks consistent with the Duchess of Blackthorne's personal correspondence seal. "My seal," she said, "your seal," which remained in the Blackthorne household vault after my departure from the estate in January. Something moved behind Vere's eyes. Not surprise, he was too constructed for visible surprise, but a slight recalibration. "The vault's access records are maintained by the household steward, Renwick, who has served House Blackthorne for 19 years, and whose loyalty to the Duke is documented extensively in my own records." She opened her hands on the table in front of her. Empty hands. A woman with nothing to hide, which was the most dangerous thing she could have appeared to be. "I would be very interested in reviewing the access logs for that vault since January." The chamber was quiet in the specific way of rooms where power was being redistributed in real time, and several people were trying to determine in which direction. Vere looked at her for a long moment. He had expected, she understood, one of 2 responses. The first was fear, the responsive fear of a woman who understood she was being positioned as a convenient explanation for a scandal that needed a human anchor. The second was indignation, the performed outrage of a woman who knew she was innocent and believed that innocence was a sufficient defense. She offered him neither. "Clara," she said. Clara Holt opened the documentation case and produced a specific folder, which she slid across the table toward Vere with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been waiting a long time to perform exactly this action. "The vault access logs I was able to obtain through the estate's secondary records," Seraphina said. "The household accounts, which I was legally entitled to review as part of the dissolution proceedings, contain the steward's activity log. You'll find 14 entries indicating vault access in the months following my departure. None of them are authorized by me. All of them are authorized by the Duke or by the steward acting under the Duke's standing order." She kept her voice at the same level, not cold, not warm, the specific, even temperature of someone for whom this conversation was not a crisis, but a problem to be solved. You have a correspondence network using my seal. What you do not have is any evidence that I was the one using it. One of the neutral counselors, the older one, Aldworth, who had survived 3 administrations by being genuinely useful, picked up the folder. Veer was still looking at her. The network also used your name, he said, in direct correspondence with Ambassador Delacroix. I've met Ambassador Delacroix exactly twice, she said, both times in public, at formal court functions, with no private correspondence. I'd be interested to see those letters. In time. Now, she said, if you're alleging that I corresponded with a foreign intelligence asset using my own name, I want to see the letters, because I wrote no such letters, which means someone else wrote them, which means this conversation is not actually about me at all. The empty seat was still empty. Aldworth set down the folder. He looked at Veer with the specific expression of a man who had just recalculated something. Lord Veer, Aldworth said, perhaps we should take a brief recess to... We don't need a recess, Veer said, and for the first time his voice had an edge in it that hadn't been there before. A slight thinning. A man whose strategy had just encountered friction and was deciding whether to adapt or push through. He pushed through. Lady Seraphina, he said, you had motive. Your husband's political difficulties have been extensively documented. A wife in the process of dissolving her marriage with access to House Blackthorne's correspondence infrastructure represents a convenient theory, she said, for someone who needs one. The room went very still. She had never said anything like that to a member of the Royal Council. The version of herself who had spent 5 years in Blackthorne Hall would not have said it, would have found a more oblique construction, would have embedded the challenge in enough diplomatic softening to make it deniable. That version of herself had been exhaustively trained to make her challenges invisible. She was done with invisible. I'm going to explain something to you, Lord Veer, she said, and her voice had the quality of a woman choosing her words, not for softness, but for precision. I spent 5 years married to a man who ran House Blackthorne's political operations the way he ran everything, assuming that the people around him were too managed or too afraid to look clearly at what he was actually doing. I had nothing to do for 5 years except look clearly. So yes, I kept records. Yes, I documented things. Yes, I have a clearer picture of House Blackthorne's correspondence infrastructure than the Duke's own steward, because the steward had incentives to be selectively blind, and I had only the incentive of survival. She paused. Which means I also know exactly how someone with access to that infrastructure would have used it, and I know that someone did, and I know it wasn't me. Which means that your investigation, if it is a genuine investigation and not a construction, should be pointed somewhere else. The silence in the chamber had changed texture. It was no longer the silence of a room watching a woman be maneuvered. It was the silence of a room recalibrating. Veer's hands, still flat on the table, pressed fractionally harder against the surface. A man maintaining stillness through conscious effort. You're claiming the Duke himself, he started. I'm claiming nothing about Adrian, she said. I'm claiming that my seal was in a vault I did not control, that my name was used in correspondence I did not write, and that the person with the most access to both of those things over the past 9 months was not me. She let that sit for exactly the right duration. I'm also claiming that whoever is using this investigation to position me as an answer to a question that is politically inconvenient should understand that I have been building documentation for 5 years, and I am not done building it. Aldworth made a small sound that was not quite a cough. Veer looked at her for a long moment. She returned it without any of the things she would have performed in the Blackthorne Hall version of this meeting, without the careful deference, without the managed anxiety, without the visible effort of a woman trying not to take up too much space. She took up exactly the space she needed. We'll want to review your records, Veer said finally. His voice had the particular flatness of a man making a tactical retreat while maintaining the posture of advance. You'll receive copies, she said, not originals. Clara will coordinate the process. She stood, because the meeting had reached the point where staying would have been submission to his control of its duration. Lord Veer, Lord Aldworth, she nodded to the room. I expect I'll be hearing from you again soon. She walked out. Clara fell in beside her in the corridor, and they moved in silence until they had cleared 2 turns and were in the outer hall where the sound wouldn't carry back. "That was either brilliant or catastrophic," Clara said, in the flat informational tone of a woman who had survived enough difficult situations to have lost the ability to be impressed by her own nerve. "It was necessary," Seraphina said. "They came in expecting to manage me. Once you let someone manage you in an opening, you spend the rest of the proceedings trying to recover the ground." She kept walking. Her heartbeat had elevated slightly in the room and was now returning to baseline with the steady efficiency of a body that had learned to perform under pressure without breaking down. "What was the empty seat?" Clara was quiet for a step. "Lord Pemberley. He was listed on the council summons but didn't attend." Seraphina had tracked Lord Pemberley in social orbit for 5 years. A man whose relationship with Adrian had always been close in the particular way of 2 people who shared enough secrets to be useful to each other and dangerous to each other in equal measure. "Find out where he was this morning," she said. Lady Marin Ashworth's townhouse in the Court District had the deliberate, understated elegance of a woman who had spent enough time around ostentatious wealth to understand that restraint was its own kind of signal. The drawing room where she received Seraphina that evening was furnished in deep teal and warm wood, books on actual shelves rather than arranged for appearance, a fire that was sized for warmth rather than drama. Marin herself was 51, white-haired by choice rather than necessity, with the sharp particular intelligence of a woman who had survived enough that she no longer needed to perform anything. She looked at Seraphina across the tea service for a moment before speaking. "You went at Veer directly," she said. "You heard already. Aldworth sent a note within the hour. He's been waiting for someone to do that for 2 years. Marin poured tea with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided the situation did not require urgency. "He's also concerned. Veer doesn't retreat cleanly. He reconfigures." "I know." Seraphina accepted the cup. "What does Veer actually want?" Marin looked at her with something that was not quite a smile. A woman appreciating the correct question. "Veer wants the investigation of House Blackthorne to resolve in a way that doesn't implicate his investments in the Delacroix network," she said. "He has been, for approximately 3 years, on the beneficial end of the same intelligence arrangement he is now investigating, which means he needs the inquiry to produce an answer that is plausible, politically satisfying, and definitively not Cassian Veer. He needed Adrian's wife. He needed someone adjacent to Blackthorne who was already publicly discredited. A woman who had publicly abandoned her marriage was a cleaner answer than the Duke himself, who still has enough allies to make a direct accusation explosive." Marin set down her cup. "What he did not factor in was that you are not, as it turns out, the version of yourself he assessed from court gossip." "He didn't assess me at all," Seraphina said. "He assessed the position. Abandoned duchess. Isolated. Dependent on the goodwill of the court for her social survival." She was quiet for a moment. "He wasn't entirely wrong about the position. He just didn't know I'd spent 8 months making the position irrelevant." Marin looked at her with the evaluating attention of a woman who had seen enough court maneuvering to identify the real thing when it was in the room with her. "You know something," Marin said. "I have documentation," Seraphina said. "From 5 years of watching Adrian's correspondence infrastructure. I didn't know what it was for at the time. I kept records because records were the only protection I had. But I have letters, account transfers, the record of access to certain sealed documents in the Blackthorne household." She looked at Marin directly. "Including the access record for a meeting 14 months ago between Adrian Stewart and an attaché whose name appears in the council's intelligence files as a Delacroix liaison." The room was very quiet. "That predates your departure," Marin said, "by 8 months. Which means the network was already running before the masquerade, before the dissolution proceedings, before there was any version of you that could plausibly be constructed as a motivated actor." Marin sat back in her chair very slightly. "You have proof that this started before they needed a story about you." "I have the beginning of proof," Seraphina said, "which is why I need the rest of it, and why I need to understand who's running this inquiry in ways that Veer can't control." "Aldworth," Marin said immediately. He's bureaucratically indestructible, and he despises Veer with the specific passion of a man who has been professionally obligated to tolerate someone for 2 decades. If you can give him something clean and documented, I can give him the steward, Seraphina said. I believe Renwick has been operating as the network's internal courier. I believe he was placed in Adrian's household not by Adrian, but by Veer, 8 years ago, as a long-term asset. I believe Adrian had no idea. She paused, which is almost more useful than if he had, because it means the network was running through Blackthorne without Adrian's knowledge, using his infrastructure, his seal, his name, and mine as operational cover. Marin was looking at her with an expression that had moved past evaluation into something quieter. You've been building this case, Marin said, not just protecting yourself. You've been building it. I've been surviving, Seraphina said. The case is what surviving produced. Outside the window, the Capitol moved in its evening rhythms. The carriages, the lamplighters beginning their circuits, the sound of the court district settling into its nocturnal social operations. Seraphina had grown up on the edge of this world and spent 5 years inside it, and had felt, for most of that time, like a woman pressing her face against glass from the wrong side. Felt different now. Not comfortable. She was not stupid enough to mistake the current moment for comfort. Veer was not finished. The investigation had tentacles she hadn't yet mapped. And somewhere in the architecture of what she was beginning to understand, there was a piece she was still missing. The piece that explained why the network had started when it had started, why it had used Blackthorne specifically, and why it had been constructed in a way that left in the rubble a very clean path to the door of the woman who had just become Adrian's former wife. I need access to the full council correspondence file, she said. Not copies, the originals. I need to see the actual letters they're attributing to me. Aldworth can arrange that, Marin said. But Seraphina, if those letters exist and they're detailed enough to have convinced 7 counselors to summon you, whoever wrote them knew you, knew your voice, your patterns, your correspondence habits. Seraphina had been thinking about that since the letter arrived at Valawick. She had been thinking about it in the carriage all the way to the Capitol. She had been thinking about it through the council meeting and through the walk to Marin's townhouse. Someone who knew her correspondence patterns, someone who had access to her seal, someone who had been inside the Blackthorne household long enough to understand how she wrote, what she wrote, who she wrote to. She had been in the Blackthorne household for 5 years. She had been careful. She had believed, careful enough. But careful and invisible were not the same thing. And there was someone in the wreckage of her marriage who had been watching her the way she had been watching Adrian, building a case, assembling materials, waiting for a moment when her exit from the household could be converted into an explanation for something that needed explaining. Marin, she said, when I left Blackthorne Hall in January, who knew I was leaving before I left? Marin frowned very slightly. What do you mean? The carriage was arranged 3 days in advance. The arrangements went through the household. She kept her voice even. Someone in that household knew I was going before the masquerade happened. Someone knew I was going and understood that a woman in the middle of a dissolution, with no current address the council could easily reach, would make a useful absence. Marin was very still. There's someone else, Seraphina said. Not Veer, not Adrian, not Renwick. Someone who was inside my life and close enough to it to write in my voice. She looked at the fire. Someone I trusted. The words sat between them in the warm room like a piece of broken glass. Before Marin could respond, the door to the drawing room opened. The housekeeper, a composed woman named Delia, who had the bearing of someone long accustomed to the specific rhythms of her employer's world, stepped in with the particular expression she reserved for information that could not wait for the appropriate moment. I beg your pardon, Delia said. There is a messenger. He says he's from Lord Aldworth's office. She paused. He says it can't wait until morning. Seraphina and Marin looked at each other. Marin nodded once. Send him in. The messenger was young, official, and visibly uncomfortable with the weight of what he was carrying. He handed Seraphina the sealed envelope and stepped back and waited. She broke the seal. The letter was short. Aldworth wrote with the crisp informational economy of a bureaucrat who had spent 40 years saying exactly what needed to be said, and nothing that could be used against him later. It said, The council convened an emergency session this evening. New evidence has been presented by Lord Vere. The Duke of Blackthorne was taken into custody 2 hours ago on charges of treason and conspiracy. Vere has moved to accelerate the full proceedings. She read it again. Adrian, in custody. She had not expected Vere to move this fast. She had not expected Vere to sacrifice Adrian. She had assumed, based on everything she knew about the way this kind of political arrangement operated, that Vere would continue to use Adrian as a buffer for as long as Adrian remained useful. Moving against Adrian directly meant Vere was either panicking or had something so clean against the Duke that he no longer needed to maintain the fiction of the investigation's neutrality. Neither of those possibilities was comfortable. She reached the second paragraph. Lord Vere has additionally requested that the Council issue a detainment order for Seraphina Vale, formerly Duchess of Blackthorne, pending full review of her role in the network's operations. The order has not yet been approved. Lord Aldworth has requested a 12-hour stay on the grounds of procedural review. 12 hours. She looked up from the letter. Marin was watching her with the steady attention of a woman who had seen enough crises to know not to react before she had the full information. He moved Adrian to clear the board, Seraphina said. Her voice was completely level. Inside her chest, something was happening that was not fear. It was beyond fear into the specific cold clarity that arrived sometimes on the other side of it. If Adrian is the primary defendant, Vere controls the narrative of what the network was and who ran it. He can shape the evidence. He can shape the inquiry's conclusions. He can make this whatever he needs it to be. She set the letter down on the tea table. And if I'm detained, I can't produce the documentation that contradicts his version. How long would it take you to get the documentation in front of Aldworth? Marin asked. Clara has the primary files. The steward's access logs, the account transfers, the Delacroix liaison record. She was thinking fast, in the specific gear she had developed over 8 months of operating on her own. Not the reactive thinking of a woman inside someone else's system, but the forward calculating attention of a person who had learned to see 3 moves ahead because she could not afford to see only one. 2 hours to compile. Another hour to deliver. Aldworth needs to have it before Vere reconvenes the full council. Then you have 9 hours, Marin said. She stood with the decisive economy of a woman who had made her calculation and was finished sitting. Delia will arrange a secure room for Clara to work in. My connections in the records office can get you the vault access logs from the Blackthorne estate through channels Vere can't monitor. She looked at Seraphina with the expression of someone committing to a position they have fully considered. I want to be clear about something. If I help you with this, I am making an enemy of Cassian Vere. He will know within 24 hours that I was involved. I know, Seraphina said. I'm not asking you to. I'm not objecting, Marin said. I'm informing you, so that you understand what this means and who you owe when it's finished. She crossed the room and opened the door. I've been waiting for someone to properly back Vere into a corner for 2 years. The fact that it's you is not what I expected, but then you keep not being what anyone expected. She called for Delia, and the house came alive with the specific quiet efficiency of an operation being assembled by people who knew how to move carefully in the dark. Seraphina stood and looked at the fire for exactly 3 seconds. Adrian in custody, a detainment order pending on her own name, Vere holding the council's narrative with both hands and tightening his grip. 9 hours. And somewhere inside all of it, the piece she still didn't have, the person who had written in her voice, who had known her patterns, who had watched her build her exit from Blackthorne Hall and had turned that exit into a weapon pointed back at her. She knew, standing in Marin Ashworth's firelit drawing room at the edge of the most dangerous night of her life, that she was not going to find that person by waiting for them to surface. She was going to have to make herself findable. She was going to have to walk back into the one place that person would expect her to avoid. She was going to have to go back to Blackthorne Hall. Tonight, Blackthorne Hall at midnight looked exactly like what it was. A house that had been built to intimidate and had never once forgotten its purpose. Seraphina had lived inside it for 5 years, and she had never stopped finding it oppressive, which was either a personal failing or an accurate reading of the architecture. The iron gate stood open, which was wrong. The household staff reduced a skeleton crew during Adrian's absence, which made operational sense. But the gates should have been locked. The Crown's custody of the Duke meant the estate was technically under administrative hold, which meant access should have required documentation she didn't have. The open gates were the first thing that felt like a trap. She went in anyway. The carriage she'd borrowed from Marin's household she left at the far end of the entrance road, behind the stand of yew trees that lined the eastern approach. She went on foot the last quarter mile, which was not comfortable in the dark, and was not supposed to be comfortable. Discomfort sharpened the particular quality of attention she needed right now, the flat, measuring attention that didn't perform fear and didn't suppress it either, just metabolized it into usable information. The household entrance, the one that servants used and that she had used herself during years of navigating Blackthorne Hall in ways that avoided Adrian's sightlines, was unlocked. She found this with her hand on the latch and stood in the cold for 3 full seconds processing it. Unlocked. She went in. The back corridor was dark except for the low burn of the wall sconces kept lit overnight. She knew this corridor the way she knew the inside of her own chest. Every turning, every door, every place where the floorboards had a specific voice underfoot that she had learned to navigate silently during the years when silence was the most important skill she had. Third board from the east stair landing, the loose fitting on the library passage door that caught if you didn't lift it slightly on the handle, the cold draft that came through the servants' hall gap that had never been properly sealed and that she had submitted 3 requests to have repaired, and that had never been repaired because it was in a part of the house Adrian never occupied. She moved through it fast and quiet. The steward's office was her target. Renwick kept his operational records in the lower left cabinet of the secondary desk. She had known this for 2 years, had confirmed it once during a period when she'd had 2 hours alone in the administrative wing and had used them with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who understood that information gathered in safety was always worth more than information gathered under pressure. She needed the ledger, the specific ledger that Renwick maintained under the heading of Household Correspondence Dispatch, which was the sanitized title for the record of every letter that had left Blackthorne Hall bearing any seal or any name belonging to the estate, including hers, including the ones she hadn't written. She reached the administrative wing. The office door was open. She stopped in the corridor. Not from fear exactly, from the body's smarter-than-conscious reading of a situation that had more variables than she'd expected. She stood in the shadow of the doorframe and looked at the room. The lamp was lit. The secondary desk's lower left cabinet was open, the drawer pulled all the way out, the ledger gone. Seraphina's jaw tightened by a fraction. Someone had been here before her, someone who knew what she'd come for. She turned. Clara Holt was standing at the end of the corridor. Seraphina's mind produced, in the first 2 seconds, a perfectly reasonable explanation for why Clara was there. Clara had anticipated the same target. Clara had followed a parallel line of reasoning and arrived at the same location. Clara was resourceful and intelligent and had been working on this case with her for months, and it was entirely logical that Clara was holding the ledger. The lamp from the office threw enough light down the corridor that Seraphina could see her face clearly. The specific quality of Clara's face in that moment was something she would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately name. It was not guilt. Guilt had a specific collapsing quality, an inward motion. This was something else, something with more structural integrity. A woman who had made a decision and was standing inside it. Clara, Seraphina said. The word came out completely flat. Not a question, not an accusation yet. Just the name, deployed like a marker placed on a map to establish position. You shouldn't have come here tonight, Clara said. How long? Seraphina asked. Clara's chin lifted very slightly. Seraphina, how long? Not a question this time either. The silence in the corridor lasted approximately 4 seconds. Seraphina counted them with the involuntary precision of a person whose body was measuring every variable of a situation that had just become unrecognizable. 3 years, Clara said. I was placed in your path 3 years ago. The cold in the corridor had nothing to do with the temperature. 3 years ago, Seraphina had found Clara Holt through what she had believed was a recommendation from a colleague of her family's solicitor, a woman whose credentials were impeccable and whose discretion had seemed like the specific, useful discretion of a professional who understood the delicacy of her client's situation. 3 years ago, Seraphina had been in the second worst period of the marriage, the period after she had stopped expecting change and before she had fully committed to planning exit, and Clara had appeared with exactly the right combination of competence and apparent loyalty. Placed. By Veer, Seraphina said. Initially, Clara's voice had the even quality of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. The relationship evolved. Evolved? The word came out with a texture that Seraphina didn't try to smooth. You helped me build the case. You organized the documentation. You structured the dissolution proceedings. You were in every room where I decided what I was doing next. She looked at the ledger in Clara's hands. Everything I had, you knew. Everything I was planning to produce for Aldworth. Yes. So Veer knew. Veer has known your position precisely since January, Clara said. Every letter you sent from Valawick, every meeting you took, every piece of documentation you compiled. Seraphina's mind was doing two things simultaneously: the cold accounting of exactly how catastrophic this was, and the deeper, more personal reckoning of what it meant to have been watched that closely for that long by someone she had trusted with the architecture of her own survival. She had been careful. She had been deliberate. She had built something she believed was hers. It had been observed the entire time. The letters they're attributing to me, she said, the ones in my voice. I wrote them, Clara said. I've been in your correspondence for 3 years. I know your patterns better than you do. A pause. I'm sorry for that part. Don't, Seraphina said. I mean it. I said don't. Her voice had a quality in it she hadn't used before. Not the controlled evenness she'd been building all year. Something rawer, something that had been compressed for a very long time under the weight of everything she had been required to be, and was now surfacing through a crack she hadn't known existed. You don't get to apologize for that part and keep the rest. You either apologize for all of it, or you stand in what you did without decorating it. Clara was quiet. What does Veer want with the ledger? Seraphina asked. He doesn't want Aldworth to have the steward's access records. The ledger confirms that Renwick was operating under Veer's direction, not Adrian's. If Aldworth sees it, then Veer's entire construction falls apart, Seraphina said. Adrian was never running the network. Renwick was Veer's man, not Adrian's. The whole thing, the Delacroix connection, the intelligence operation, the letters in my name, it runs back to Veer, not to Blackthorne. She looked at Clara. Veer needs Adrian convicted. He needs the inquiry to close with House Blackthorne as the answer. He needs me either detained or discredited. And he needed someone inside my camp from the beginning to make sure he always knew how close I was to blowing it open. Yes, Clara said, and now you're here to take the last piece of evidence that could do it. Clara looked at her. The expression on her face had shifted slightly from the structured composure of a woman standing in a decision she'd made. Something more complicated was present now. Not guilt. Seraphina still didn't think it was guilt, but something adjacent. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been maintaining a performance in a direction that has started to feel wrong. He's going to have you detained before morning, Clara said. The detainment order goes through regardless of what Aldworth does with the 12-hour stay. Veer has 3 votes locked. He only needs 4. I know. If you're detained, the documentation you have becomes his property under the administrative hold. He goes through your records. He takes everything. Adrian gets convicted on evidence Veer controls, and you get named as a co-conspirator in a network you had nothing to do with. Clara's voice had changed slightly. The rehearsed quality was gone. I was supposed to make sure you didn't get to Aldworth tonight. I was supposed to slow you down long enough for the order to go through. Seraphina looked at the woman who had spent 3 years inside her life, wearing the face of an ally, and she felt something that was not what she had expected to feel. Not rage. Rage would have been cleaner. This was something more complicated. The specific grief of discovering that the thing you built your survival on was built on ground that was never solid, and having to decide in real time whether the ground you're standing on right now is any more reliable. Why are you telling me this? Seraphina asked. Clara looked at the ledger in her hands. "Because I've spent 3 years watching you," she said. "And somewhere in the last 8 months, somewhere between the vineyard and the mill and the letters you wrote to the tenants and the way you talked to that housekeeper, I stopped being able to convince myself that what I was doing to you was justifiable." She looked up. "Veer told me you were a convenient asset, a woman with motive and access who could absorb the inquiry's conclusion without being important enough to fight back effectively." A pause. "He was wrong about the last part. And I knew he was wrong, and I kept going anyway. That's the thing I can't apologize for cleanly, and I know it." The corridor was very quiet. Seraphina looked at the ledger. She looked at Clara. She ran the calculation, not the emotional calculation, which was a wreck she didn't have time for, but the operational one. Veer had 3 votes and needed 4. The detainment order went through before morning without intervention. Aldworth had 12 hours that were now worth considerably less than they'd been an hour ago. She had a ledger in the hands of a woman who had just disclosed that she was supposed to prevent Seraphina from doing exactly what she needed to do with it. And Clara had disclosed. That was the variable. She could be being played again. She was aware of that with the specific hypervigilance of someone who had just discovered the previous layer of deception and could not afford to assume there were only 2 layers. Clara had been Veer's instrument for 3 years. Clara had written the letters. Clara had been in every room where Seraphina planned. Disclosing now could be the next move in a deeper game. The construction of apparent loyalty at the last possible moment to ensure Seraphina made a wrong decision based on misplaced trust. She stood in the corridor with that possibility, and she held it, and she looked at Clara's face. She had spent 5 years learning to read people in a household where reading people was survival. She had been wrong before. She could be wrong now. But something in the specific texture of Clara's current expression, the exhaustion, the absence of the performed quality that she now recognized in retrospect, had been present in Clara's face for 3 years, read like something that was not a construction. "Give me the ledger," Seraphina said. Clara held it out. Seraphina took it. She stood with it in her hands for a moment, feeling its weight, which was not large. A slim accounting book, uninspiring in its physical presence, devastating in its content. "The 4th vote," she said. "Veer needs 1 more counselor. Who is it?" Clara shook her head slightly. "I don't know which one he's moving on tonight. I only know it's tonight." "Then I need to be in front of Aldworth in the next 2 hours," Seraphina said. "Not with copies. With this. With you." Clara went very still. "With me." "You wrote the letters. You can confirm you wrote them. You can confirm Veer commissioned them. You can identify the Delacroix liaison from the meetings you attended. You can corroborate the entire construction from the inside." Seraphina looked at her with the flat, direct attention of a woman who had run out of time for oblique approaches. "That's not a small thing. That's the case." "Veer will destroy me," Clara said. "He'll try," Seraphina said. "He was going to anyway, eventually. Men like Veer don't maintain assets they can no longer use. They eliminate them." She paused. "You've been working for someone who has always intended to leave you in the rubble. That was always the end of this." The lamp from the office flickered in a draft from somewhere deeper in the house. Clara Holt stood in the corridor of Blackthorne Hall at midnight, holding what was left of the decision she'd made 3 years ago, and Seraphina watched her make a different one. "All right," Clara said, "Aldworth." They moved. Fast through the servants' corridor, back toward the eastern entrance, Seraphina holding the ledger and recalculating with every step. She needed Clara's testimony formalized before Veer's 4th vote landed. She needed Aldworth reachable at this hour, which Marin had confirmed was possible through the back channel. She needed to get out of Blackthorne Hall without the entrance hall. 3 men, not household staff. The livery was Crown Administrative, the specific dark blue of the investigative arm of the Council's enforcement office, not City Guard. Council enforcement, which meant Veer had moved faster than the 12-hour stay should have allowed. The man in front was holding a document with the Council seal. "Seraphina Vale," he said, "by order of the Royal Council, you are detained pending full inquiry into—" "On whose authority?" she said. Flat. Not a question. "Lord Veer, acting as chair of the emergency session convened 2 hours ago." 2 hours ago, while she was at Marin's, while Clara was here collecting the ledger. While she had believed the 12-hour stay was holding, Aldworth's stay had been overridden. She stood in the entrance hall of Blackthorne Hall with the ledger in her hands and 3 council enforcement officers between her and the door, and she understood with the cold, complete clarity of a woman who has just run out of moves that she had been outmaneuvered, not by 1 step, by 2. Veer had sent Clara to collect the ledger, and he had sent the enforcement team simultaneously, which meant he had never needed the ledger stopped. He had needed her inside Blackthorne Hall when the detainment order executed, so that the administrative hold on the estate would immediately extend to everything she had on her person, including the ledger. She looked at Clara. Clara's face had gone very still. Whatever decision she had made in the corridor 30 seconds ago, she was now inside the consequences of it, and the consequences had arrived faster than either of them had anticipated. The officer stepped forward. "The document you're holding is subject to administrative seizure under the terms of this document," Seraphina said, "is evidence in an active proceeding that directly implicates the official who issued your orders." She kept her body absolutely still. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to move, to think faster, to find the exit she was missing. But she had learned, in 5 years of a marriage where panic was the most expensive thing she could produce, that the appearance of stillness bought time even when stillness felt impossible. Seizing it on Veer's authority would make you and your office complicit in the obstruction of that inquiry. The officer hesitated. 1 second. It was the only second she had. "Clara," she said, without looking away from the officer. "Go." "Seraphina, now." The word came out with a precision that left no room. "Aldworth, everything you know, tonight." She heard Clara move. She didn't watch her go. She kept her eyes on the officer, and she held the ledger, and she understood, with the specific total clarity of a woman who had finally run completely out of room to maneuver, that she was going to have to hand it over. But not yet, because the officer was still hesitating, and Clara's footsteps were moving through the servants' corridor, and every second of that hesitation was a second that the only person who could now break Veer's case open was getting further from this room. "Your name," Seraphina said to the officer. Steady, inexorable. "Tell me your name." "What?" "Because when this inquiry concludes, and it will conclude, the Council's review of tonight's events will examine every individual who participated in an enforcement action taken on the authority of a man who is himself a subject of that inquiry. I want to make sure the record is accurate." She looked at him with the full weight of 5 years of learning how power worked and how the people who served it were left holding consequences they hadn't designed. "Your name." The officer opened his mouth, closed it. Behind her, the servants' corridor door clicked shut. Clara was out. Seraphina set the ledger on the entrance hall table with the same deliberate precision she had used to set her wedding ring on the Blackthorne mantelpiece 9 months ago. She looked at the enforcement officer with her hands empty and her back straight and something in her face that she was done performing around. "I'll come with you," she said, "but understand something. The woman who just left this house is going to Aldworth. The ledger you're looking at contains Renwick's access records and Veer's operational signature. By the time you finish processing my detention, that information will already be in the hands of the one man on that council who cannot be bought." She let that land. "So take me in, do your job, but know that the man who sent you here has already lost." She walked toward the door, and for the first time since she had entered Blackthorne Hall, the officer stepped aside. She walked past him into the cold night air, and the detainment closed around her like a door shutting, and she walked toward what came next with her hands empty and her mind already 3 moves ahead, because the woman she had spent a year becoming did not stop calculating just because the walls had closed in. She had built herself out of exactly this kind of darkness before. She knew how to work in the dark. The detention room in the council's administrative building was designed to make people feel small. Seraphina recognized the design with the flat professional attention of someone who had spent years inside rooms built for the same purpose by a different architect. Low ceiling. 1 lamp. A table with 2 chairs positioned so that the person being detained sat with their back to the door, and the person conducting the interview sat between them and the exit. The air had the specific quality of a space that was ventilated only enough to be technically habitable. She sat in the chair with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she waited. She had been waiting for 40 minutes. This was also part of the design. The waiting, the isolation, the manufactured uncertainty about what was happening outside the room and who was talking to whom and how fast the situation was moving. She had been stripped of her bag, her correspondence, the small knife she carried in her boot that the officer had found with the professional thoroughness of someone well trained. They had not stripped her of her mind, which was operating at a speed and precision she had not known she possessed until this year had made the demand. Clara had gotten out. That was the one fixed point she kept returning to. Clara had gotten out with 8 minutes of lead time and the specific knowledge of where Aldworth could be reached after hours through channels Veer didn't control. Because Marin had given Seraphina that information, and Seraphina had given it to Clara in the corridor of Blackthorne Hall in the 30 seconds between Clara's disclosure and the enforcement officers appearing in the entrance hall. Everything now depended on a woman she had trusted completely for 3 years, and then discovered she had never known at all. The door opened. Cassian Veer walked in alone, which was either a statement of confidence or a statement of contempt, and was probably both. He looked exactly as he had in the council chamber. Exact, controlled, the specific assembled quality of a man who understood that appearance was the first argument. He sat in the chair across from her and placed his hands on the table in front of him, flat, the same position he'd held during the formal meeting, and he looked at her with the expression of a man examining a situation that has resolved in the direction he intended. "Lady Seraphina," he said, "I want you to understand that this doesn't need to be difficult." "It's already difficult," she said. "You've detained me on manufactured charges using the authority of a position you've been compromising for 3 years. That's not a foundation for an easy conversation." Veer's expression didn't change. "The charges are not manufactured. The correspondence attributed to your seal is extensive and documented. The council's inquiry is yours," she said. "The inquiry is yours. The evidence is yours. The enforcement order is yours. You've built a room and put yourself in charge of every wall, and you're asking me to accept that the room is objective." She looked at him. "I've lived in a room like that before. I know exactly what they feel like from the inside." Something shifted very slightly in Veer's face. Not much. A fractional tightening around the eyes that in a less controlled man would have been a wince. "Where's the ledger?" he asked. "Gone," she said. "Lady Seraphina, the ledger is gone, Lord Veer. You can search Blackthorne Hall. You can search my person, which your officers already have. You can extend the administrative hold to Valawick and search my estate." She held his gaze with the complete steadiness of a woman who had nothing left to lose in this specific room and had therefore stopped managing her steadiness for his benefit. "The ledger is not something you're going to recover tonight, and I think you know what that means for the timeline of your inquiry." The silence in the room had a different texture than the silence of the council chamber. Tighter, more personal, two people with no audience left to perform for. "You're making this harder on yourself," Veer said. Quiet. The gentle voice of a man applying a different instrument. "I'm making it accurate," she said. "There's a distinction." The council has 3 votes for conviction on the current evidence set. Adrian Blackthorne will be stripped of title and imprisoned. That is happening regardless of what you do tonight. He paused. "What is not fixed is your own position. You can walk out of this room tomorrow as a witness who assisted the Crown's inquiry, or you can walk out as a co-defendant. The difference between those 2 outcomes is whether you choose to be useful." Seraphina looked at Cassian Veer, at the man who had spent 3 years building an architecture of manipulation around her life, who had placed Clara Holt in her path and watched her build her survival on poisoned ground, who was now sitting across a table in a detention room at 2 a.m, offering her the specific mercy of someone who controls all the exits. And she thought about what he actually wanted. He didn't want her testimony. He had manufactured testimony. He didn't need her cooperation for the conviction. He'd said himself the 3 votes were locked. He wanted to know what she had. He wanted to know whether the ledger was with Aldworth. He wanted to know whether Clara had talked, and what Clara had said, and how far the information had traveled in the last 40 minutes. This conversation was an intelligence-gathering operation wearing the face of an offer. What does useful mean? She asked. Careful, the tone of a woman considering. A full statement about your husband's operational role in the network, specifically the Delacroix correspondence and the authorization of the household vault access. He leaned forward very slightly. You've spent 5 years watching that household. You know more about its operations than any formal investigation could recover. Your statement closes the inquiry cleanly. You walk away with full immunity and your estate intact. She let the silence run for 4 seconds. And if I confirm that Adrian authorized the vault access, she said slowly, that resolves the question of where the operational authority originated. Precisely. It also means the inquiry never needs to examine who else had access to the household infrastructure. She watched his face. Who placed staff? Who maintained relationships with the steward? Who had reason to build a network that ran through Blackthorne as cover rather than Blackthorne as origin? The flat stillness of Veer's expression was the most expressive thing she had seen from him. You're very determined to make this complicated, he said. You made it complicated, she said. I'm just refusing to pretend it's simple. The door opened. The officer who entered had the specific bearing of someone delivering information that is going to change the temperature of the room. He leaned down and spoke quietly beside Veer's ear, and Seraphina watched Veer's hands on the table, because hands were where the control broke first when control broke, and she saw the fractional pressure increase of Veer's fingertips against the wood. The officer left. Veer sat back. Lord Aldworth, he said, with a flatness that was doing significant work, has convened an emergency review session. Seraphina said nothing. Apparently he has received new documentation regarding the vault access records. Veer's voice had the quality of a man maintaining structural integrity under a load that is exceeding the design specification, and testimony from a solicitor who has made some remarkable claims about the origins of the network's correspondence. Clara had gotten there. Clara had talked. Seraphina kept her face at the same temperature. The review session, Veer said, does not have the authority to override the detainment order. No, she agreed, but it has the authority to expand the scope of the inquiry, which means it has the authority to add subjects. She looked at him. Aldworth has been waiting for exactly this for 2 years. You told me that. Not in those words, but you told me. The way you dismissed him in the council chamber. The way your officers moved before his stay had expired. She paused. You made an enemy of the most bureaucratically indestructible man in the kingdom because you assumed his patience meant passivity. That was your miscalculation, Lord Veer, not mine. Veer stood. The movement was controlled. He was not a man who allowed himself uncontrolled movements. But the speed of it, the way it abandoned the deliberately relaxed posture he had maintained for the entire conversation, said everything that his face was refusing to say. This conversation is concluded, he said. Yes, she said. I think it is. He left. The door locked behind him. Seraphina sat in the detention room with her hands in her lap, and she breathed slowly and she let the full weight of the last hour process through her body in the way that full weight needed to. Not suppressed, not managed, just felt, because she had learned that feelings suppressed in crisis had a way of collecting interest and presenting the bill at the worst possible moment. Clara had made it. The ledger was with Aldworth. The testimony was on record. She was still detained. That hadn't changed, but the geometry of the room had changed. Veer had come in here holding all the walls, and he had left with at least one wall no longer his. She waited. Back in. At 4 a.m, the door opened again, and it was not Veer. Aldworth was 70 years old and looked like a man who had been dragged out of bed and was carrying the specific energy of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular problem to become solvable, and has just discovered it has become solvable at 4 a.m. and considers this an acceptable trade-off. He had 2 of his own staff with him. Neither of them wore Veer's livery. Lady Seraphina, he said, I apologize for the conditions. We'll be moving you to more appropriate accommodation while the review session completes. The detainment order? She asked. Under challenge on procedural grounds as of 90 minutes ago. He looked at her with the precise attention of a man doing rapid assessment. The solicitor's testimony is detailed and consistent. The ledger is... He paused, and she saw in that pause the specific reaction of a bureaucratic professional encountering evidence that exceeds expectation. The ledger is very thorough. Renwick kept good records, she said. He was Veer's man. Veer required precision. Yes. Aldworth's voice had a dry quality that was probably the closest he came to satisfaction. He did. He stepped back from the door. If you're willing, I'd like your statement tonight, before Veer's people can move to challenge the review's jurisdiction. She stood. Every muscle in her body had the specific complaint of someone who had been running on compressed attention and cold air for 6 hours and would need to sleep eventually, though not yet. I'm willing, she said. The statement took 2 hours. Aldworth asked questions with the methodical precision of a man who had been conducting inquiries for 40 years and understood that the most important information was usually in the details the witness thought were too small to matter. He asked about the vault, about the steward's patterns, about the household correspondence infrastructure, about the specific letters she had intercepted over 5 years and what they contained and how she had stored the copies and where those copies currently were. She answered everything. She answered without the management she had applied to every piece of information she'd ever shared inside Blackthorne Hall, without calculating what it cost, without measuring what it revealed, without performing the careful modulation of a woman who had always understood that information shared was information that could be used against her. She was done with that. She had been building toward being done with it for a year without knowing that was what she was building toward. At 6 a.m, as the Capitol's early light was beginning to gray the single small window of the record office where the statement was being taken, Aldworth set down his pen and looked at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion. Lord Veer will not survive this inquiry, he said. Flat. Informational. That's not a political statement. It's an assessment of the evidentiary record. And Adrian? She asked. Aldworth was quiet for a moment. The Duke was not running the network. The evidence is clear on that. He was careless. His household was penetrated because he didn't pay attention to who Renwick was and where Renwick's loyalties ran. He paused. Carelessness is not conspiracy. He'll lose influence. The title will survive. The house will survive. Diminished. A beat. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not. You could have let him take the full weight of it, Aldworth said. Not an accusation, a genuine observation from a man who found human decision-making interesting. The inquiry was moving toward him. You had reason to let it. She thought about that. About Adrian in the custody cell somewhere in this building, or the one adjacent, in the same dark and waiting she'd been in 3 hours ago, probably believing that the shape of his ruin had been determined and that the woman he'd spent 5 years failing to see clearly was somewhere in the architecture of it. I didn't do this to protect him, she said. I did it because the truth was the only thing I had that was actually mine. Every other resource I built this year was built on ground that turned out to be observed, documented, reported back. She looked at the window. The gray light was becoming something warmer. The truth of what actually happened was the one thing Veer couldn't falsify, because he needed the falsification of it to be his protection. The moment I could put the real version in front of someone who couldn't be bought, it was over. She paused. I wasn't protecting Adrian. I was refusing to be used as the reason the real story never got told. Aldworth looked at her for a moment. Then he made a small sound that was, she thought, the 70-year-old bureaucratic equivalent of respect. The dissolution proceedings, he said. They'll be complicated by the inquiry's administrative hold on House Blackthorne assets. I know. It will take time. I have time, she said. I've been building things that take time. I've gotten used to it. The council chamber at 8 a.m. had a different population than it had carried the day before. Veer was present, which surprised her. She had expected him to have developed an urgent reason to be elsewhere, but his presence had the quality of a man who had made the calculation that absence would read worse than attendance and had arrived with the constructed composure of someone who had not yet publicly conceded that the walls were coming down. Adrian was present also, released from custody into the chamber for the formal proceeding. and he looked like a man who had spent the night inside the specific terror of a person who has been powerful long enough to have forgotten what powerlessness felt like, and has just been reintroduced to it. He was still the same Adrian, the same exact physical presence, the same dark hair and controlled bearing, but something in the assurance of him had been interfered with, the way a perfectly engineered structure looked different once you knew there was a crack in the foundation. He saw her when she came in. He looked at her for 3 seconds with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between the personal and the political, between the man who had knelt in her grandmother's drawing room and the Duke who had spent 9 months watching his empire develop problems he didn't understand the shape of. She looked back at him without expression and took her seat. Aldworth opened the session with the specific bureaucratic authority of a man who had waited 2 years for this morning and intended to use every procedural tool available to him with maximum precision. He read the expanded scope of the inquiry into the record. He formally entered Clara Holt's testimony. He formally entered the ledger. And then he looked at Vere. "Lord Vere," he said, "the review session has identified documentary evidence suggesting that the operational authority for the Delacroix network originated within this chamber, rather than within House Blackthorne. I am formally requesting your voluntary recusal from all proceedings related to this inquiry pending a full independent review of your role." The room went absolutely still. Vere stood. He did it slowly, with the specific deliberateness of a man who understood that this moment was being read by everyone present and intended to control his exit from it even now. "This is procedurally irregular," he said. "It is entirely regular," Aldworth said. "Section 42 of the Council's Inquiry Charter permits the Review Board to request recusal on the basis of newly entered evidentiary conflict of interest. I have entered the evidence. I am making the request." A pause that was not quite a pause. "I would recommend compliance, Lord Vere. The alternative is a formal removal motion, which I will also make if necessary, and which I have the votes to carry." Seraphina watched Cassian Vere stand in the council chamber at 8 in the morning and perform the final calculation of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. He looked at her once, and just for a moment, with the expression of a man making an accurate assessment of exactly where his miscalculation had occurred. She returned it with the same flat steadiness she had maintained through the detention room, and the statement and the 6 hours of cold and waiting. He gathered his documents. He walked out of the chamber with his back straight and his pace controlled, and the entire weight of what was coming held in the precise posture of a man who refused, even at the end, to let anyone see him stumble. The door closed behind him. The chamber exhaled. Aldworth looked at his notes, looked at Adrian, looked at Seraphina. "I believe, but," he said, "we have a great deal of work to do." Adrian turned in his chair and looked at her fully for the first time that morning. His face had the open, exposed quality of a man stripped of the scaffolding he had built his self-understanding on. His title was going to survive. His estate was going to survive. But the version of himself he had been, the man who had assumed that his power was a permanent condition of the world rather than a construction dependent on the behavior of the people around him, that version was standing in the wreckage of its own foundations. "Seraphina," he said. Quiet. Just her name. She looked at him, at the man she had left 9 months ago, at the man she had gone back to save, Mater, not to protect him, not to forgive him, but because the truth required telling, and he happened to be in the path of a lie that was bigger than either of them. There was a version of this moment, she knew, that would have been satisfying in a different way. The version where she looked at him across the ruins of everything he'd been and felt the clean, specific pleasure of a woman watching a man get exactly what he gave. She didn't feel that. She felt something quieter, the specific exhaustion of being done. Done with the marriage, done with the fear, done with the 5 years of careful survival in a house that had never been a home. Done in the way that left you not vindicated, but simply finished. "Don't," she said. Same word she'd said to Clara in the corridor. Same meaning. Because there was nothing he could say that would change the shape of what this had been, and there was nothing she needed from him now. Not apology, not explanation, not the particular grief of a proud man confronting the cost of his own blindness. She had the ledger. She had the testimony. She had the truth in Aldworth's record. She had Valawick and the vineyard coming into its second season, and the trading arrangement that Clara had known about and that was still, somehow, still hers. She had the woman she had become in a year of working in the dark with no one watching. That was enough. That was more than enough. Aldworth called the session to order, and Seraphina turned back to face the front of the room, and Adrian Blackthorne sat beside her in the council chamber for the last time, and the inquiry began. Outside the chamber windows, the capital was fully awake now. The noise of it building, the carriages and the market calls, and the specific living sound of a city that had been going about its business while empires cracked, and women sat in detention rooms, and men discovered the weight of the things they had chosen not to see. She sat in it, and she breathed, and she waited for what came next. And then the door at the back of the chamber opened, and the Crown's senior investigator walked in with two men behind him, and he was carrying a document that even from across the room she could see bore the king's personal seal, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man delivering a procedural update. It was the expression of a man delivering something that was going to change the shape of the room. Aldworth looked up, went very still. Seraphina looked at the document, at the seal, at the investigator's face, and understood, before he said a single word, that the inquiry she had spent the night surviving was not, in fact, the full scope of what was coming. The document the investigator carried bore the king's seal and the specific weight of something that had been decided before anyone in this room had arrived this morning. Aldworth read it standing. His face did not change. The trained composure of a man who had received difficult documents in difficult rooms for 40 years. But his hands, Seraphina noticed, held the paper with the fractional additional pressure of someone absorbing a shock through the only channel available. He set it on the table. "The Crown," he said, "has expanded the inquiry's scope to include all operations connected to the Delacroix network over the past 4 years. This includes all correspondence, all financial transfers, and all personnel with documented connection to the network's infrastructure." He looked up at the investigator. "The king is taking personal oversight of the proceedings from this point." The investigator nodded once. "His Majesty requests the presence of Lady Seraphina Vale at the palace this afternoon, as a witness, not a subject." A pause that carried its own precision. He is aware of the circumstances of last night's detainment and considers the matter of the order's legitimacy resolved. The detainment order was dissolved. That was what it meant, stripped of its formal language. Veer's instrument had been acknowledged as Veer's instrument and set aside. Seraphina sat with that information and felt, in the place where fear had been living for the past 12 hours, a specific exhausted relief that she did not perform for the room. She let it move through her quietly and completely, and then she set it down the same way she had learned to set down everything that was finished with. Not suppressed, not celebrated, just acknowledged and released. "Thank you," she said to the investigator. He looked at her with the particular respect of a professional who has read a file thoroughly and has formed views about its subject. "The palace at 2 o'clock, Lady Seraphina." He left. The chamber settled into the altered quiet of a room that has just had its ceiling raised. Aldworth looked at his notes, looked at the document, looked at the door through which Veer had walked an hour ago, and through which the investigator had just departed, and in his face Seraphina could read the specific satisfaction of a man who had been right about something for a very long time and was watching the record catch up to him. Adrian had not moved. He was sitting 2 chairs from her with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and he was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing interior accounting of a kind he had probably never been required to do before. His title would survive. Aldworth had said that clearly, but the king's personal oversight of the expanded inquiry meant that every aspect of House Blackthorne's operations for the past 4 years was now subject to Crown examination, and Adrian was intelligent enough to understand what that meant for the shape of the next several years of his life. He would survive. He would be smaller. He would have to rebuild. And rebuilding from a position of diminished power for a man who had only ever known power as a permanent condition was going to require something he had not previously been asked to develop. That was not her problem. She had understood, somewhere in the last 12 hours, that it had never been her problem. That the version of herself who had spent 5 years trying to find the lever that would change Adrian Blackthorne had been working on a project that was not hers to complete. People changed when the cost of not changing became unbearable, and not one moment before and nothing she did or said or demonstrated had ever been able to move that calculation for him. Only this could. Only the complete structural failure of everything he had assumed was permanent. Whether he used it was his own work now. Aldworth was speaking again. Procedural matters, scheduling, the mechanics of an inquiry that had just tripled in scope. And Seraphina listened with the part of her attention that the situation required and let the rest of her be, for the first time in a very long time, simply present in a room without managing the room's perception of her. It felt strange, like a muscle she had forgotten existed, suddenly asked to bear weight. It held. She slept for 3 hours in the room Marin's household had prepared, a dreamless, compressed sleep that her body extracted from the available time with the efficiency of something that had been running too long and knew it. She woke with the specific clarity that came after that kind of sleep, not refreshed exactly but recalibrated. The noise of the previous 24 hours settled into a form she could see the shape of. She dressed carefully. Not for Adrian, not for the court, not for the performance of any version of herself she had previously been required to produce. She dressed the way she had been learning to dress at Valawick, for herself, in the midnight blue that was hers, with the Valawick crest on the small brooch at her collar. Marin was in the downstairs sitting room when she came down, and Clara Holt was there also, sitting in the chair nearest the window with the specific stillness of a woman who is uncertain of her welcome and has decided to wait and see rather than manufacture it. Seraphina looked at Clara for a moment. 3 years. The woman had been in her life for 3 years. She knew the sound of Clara's thinking, the particular quality of her silences when she was working through a problem, the way she organized documentation, the specific precision of her language when she was being careful about something. She knew all of this, and none of it had changed, and simultaneously all of it was different now in the way that objects looked different when the light source changed. Aldworth's people got to you, Seraphina said. An hour after I arrived, Clara said. The testimony took until sunrise. She paused. He's thorough. Yes. I told him everything, Clara said, the full 3 years. The structure of the original placement, the contact protocol with Veer's office, the specific correspondence I fabricated. Her voice was even. The evenness cost her something. Seraphina could see that cost clearly now, with the particular vision of someone who had just stripped a layer of their own assumptions and was seeing the people beneath them more clearly. I want you to know that I told him everything, not because it was the strategically correct move, because it was the only thing I could do that was actually clean. Seraphina sat in the chair across from her. Marin, with the quiet discretion of a woman who understood when a room needed fewer people in it, found a reason to be in the adjacent study. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, Seraphina said. It's not all right. What you did caused real damage to real things. To my case, to my safety, to the year I spent building something on ground you were reporting back to a man who wanted to use it against me. She looked at Clara directly. I'm also not going to tell you that what you did last night meant nothing. It meant something. You made a choice in that corridor that you didn't have to make, and it cost you considerably, and it was the right choice. She paused. Those two things can both be true. Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been prepared for anger and had encountered something that required more of her than anger would have. What happens now? Clara asked. Aldworth will need you for the full inquiry. Your testimony is central to the case against Veer. Seraphina kept her voice even. After that, I don't know. That depends on what the Crown decides to do with witnesses who are placed assets rather than principals. And between us? It was the question Seraphina had been sitting with since the corridor of Blackthorne Hall. The professional answer was clean. Clara's usefulness to the inquiry made her an asset to maintain a working relationship with, and the information Clara possessed about the Delacroix network was significant enough that burning the relationship entirely would be operationally short-sighted. But the professional answer was not the only answer, and she had spent too long giving only the answers that were strategically correct to mistake that for the full truth. I don't know that yet either, she said. I know that you were placed in my life as an instrument and became something more complicated than that, and that the more complicated thing is the reason I'm not in a Crown detention facility this morning. I know that trust, once broken the way you broke it, doesn't rebuild on a conversation. She looked at her hands for a moment. I know that I'm not in the business of punishing people for the most honest thing they've ever done. So, she looked up. We'll see. Clara nodded. Twice. The specific nod of a woman accepting terms that are more than she deserved and less than she wanted, and exactly what the situation warranted. The palace audience was not what she expected. She had been in the palace before, at formal functions, in the specific managed context of court events where the king was a ceremonial presence at a fixed distance. This was different. A private receiving room, modest in scale relative to the palace's usual grammar, with 2 chairs and a fire, and a man who looked tired in the specific way of a person carrying something heavy for a long time. The king was 57. He had been on the throne for 22 years and wore that duration in his face, not badly, not as defeat, but as the accumulated weight of having been required to make consequential decisions for a very long time, and having understood, eventually, that consequence was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be inhabited. He did not stand when she entered, which was his prerogative, but he gestured toward the chair across from him with a directness that contained no performance. Lady Seraphina, he said. Sit. I'll be direct with you because the situation has used up most of my patience for indirection. She sat. She looked at him with the same clear attention she had brought to every significant room this year. Vera will be prosecuted, the king said. The evidence your former solicitor provided, combined with the ledger, is sufficient to support charges that will end his public life. A pause. He had significant reach. The inquiry will be long, and it will be uncomfortable, and it will involve people whose connection to the network will surprise the court. He looked at her. Your name will come up throughout. The manufactured correspondence, your detainment, the construction of your position as a convenient subject. All of that will be part of the public record. I know, she said. It will be unpleasant, he said. Even when it's clear you were a target rather than a participant, the association is difficult to avoid. That's the nature of this kind of proceeding. Yes. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who had spent 22 years assessing people and had not lost the habit. You're not frightened, he said. Not quite a question. I've been frightened, she said. Last night, several times in the last year. But I've learned that being frightened and being stopped are different things, and the difference is a choice you make at a specific moment and then have to keep making. She paused. I'm tired. I'm not frightened. Something in the king's face shifted. Not softness exactly, recognition. House Blackthorne, he said. Adrian's title survives. His operational authority within the court will be significantly curtailed pending the inquiry's full completion, which may take 2 years. He was careless rather than treasonous. There's a meaningful distinction. He picked up the cup on the table beside him and held it without drinking. The dissolution of your marriage is confirmed effective as of this morning. The administrative hold on your estate is lifted. Your assets are clear. The dissolution. Final. Confirmed by the king's own office rather than the slow machinery of the court system. She had known it was coming. She had been building toward it for a year. She had placed the ring on the mantelpiece 9 months ago as a statement of intent, and every day since had been the working out of what that intent meant in practice. And yet, sitting in the palace receiving room hearing it stated cleanly and finally, she felt something move through her that was not celebration and was not grief and was not quite relief either. Something more elemental. The specific sensation of a door that has been ajar for a long time finally settling into its frame. Thank you, she said. There is one more thing, the king said. The Crown's Trading Commission has been reviewing the applications for charter status in the eastern commercial districts. Your Valawick trading arrangement has come to our attention. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement if it had been in a face more accustomed to amusement. It is, by the assessment of the Commission, unusually well structured for something that originated as a small estates recovery project. I had good information about where the gaps were, she said. We'd like to discuss a formal charter, he said. The details would go through the Commission's standard process, but the Crown has an interest in supporting commercial infrastructure that is competently managed and independent of the kind of entanglements that have recently caused us considerable difficulty. He looked at her steadily. We are, In other words, interested in businesswomen who are not beholden to the men this court has spent the last decade over-relying on. Seraphina looked at the king of the kingdom in the small private room in the morning light, and she understood that this was not a gift. It was a recognition, a different thing. Gifts could be taken back. Recognition, once accurate, was simply accurate. "I'll look forward to the commission's process," she said. She found Adrian in the corridor outside the council records office at midday, which was where Clara had quietly indicated he would be, submitting his formal statement to Aldworth's team. She had not planned to speak to him. She had planned to pass through the corridor and let the day continue without the weight of a conversation that had already had its natural conclusion. He saw her before she could recalibrate. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and had spent those 30 hours doing the interior reckoning he had avoided for years. The precise assembly of him was present. He was still Adrian, still the man who had been built by 20 years of inhabiting power. But something in the underlying structure was different. The specific quality of a man who has had his scaffolding removed and is standing on his own actual ground for the first time in a long time. It was not comfortable ground, but it was his. "Seraphina," he said. She stopped. The corridor was empty except for them. "You could have let it close on me," he said. "The inquiry was moving toward conviction. Veer had the votes. The version where I went to prison and you walked away clean was available." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you take it?" She looked at him, at the man she had married at 19, who had failed her in the ways that careless people failed the people they were supposed to see and didn't, who had been hollowed out by a year of consequence into something that looked, for the first time in her knowledge of him, genuinely open. "Because it wasn't true," she said, "and I've spent 5 years inside a story that wasn't true. I'm not building the next part of my life on another one." She held his gaze. "You were careless, Adrian, not monstrous. Careless is its own damage, but it's a different thing, and I wasn't willing to let Veer use your carelessness as cover for his actual crimes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's more than I gave you." "Yes," she said. "It is." He absorbed that without flinching, which was the first time she had ever seen him absorb an accurate accounting of his own failures without the reflexive reframing that had always been his defense. The reframing wasn't there. Whatever had happened to him in the last 24 hours had taken it somewhere he couldn't immediately access. "The necklace," he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not as an apology, not as justification, but as a man naming the thing he had done with the specific reluctant honesty of someone who has stopped being able to not name it. "I knew what it meant. When I put it on her, I knew." "I know you knew," she said. "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought if I made it visible enough, you would react. You would finally—" He exhaled. "I thought if I pushed far enough, I would get something from you that you had stopped giving me." She looked at him for a long moment. "You wanted a fight." "I wanted a response." He looked at the floor briefly and then back at her. "You had gotten so contained, so careful. I couldn't reach you, and I didn't know how to say that, so You performed cruelty instead," she said. Quiet. Not harsh. Just accurate. "Because cruelty got a reaction when conversation wouldn't." He said nothing. "I was contained because I was surviving," she said. "The containment was what surviving looked like inside your house. I couldn't afford to be reachable. I couldn't afford to let you see me clearly because every time I had, early in the marriage, you used what you saw to manage me better." She paused. "We built each other's worst defenses, Adrian. You needed someone who stayed. I needed someone I could trust. We spent 5 years failing each other in the exact right way to make both of us worse." He was looking at her with the expression of a man hearing his own life narrated in a language he had not known existed. "Is there anything—" he started. "No," she said. Not unkindly, with the specific gentleness of absolute honesty. "That's not what this is. There's no version of this where we go back and repair the architecture, because the architecture was wrong from the beginning, and rebuilding it correctly would require both of us to be people we weren't then, and the time was then." She looked at him steadily. "What there is this. You have work to do, real work, not the management of appearances, not the performance of authority, but the actual interior work of a person who has been stripped of everything he used to avoid knowing himself. She paused. That's not a small thing. Most people never get forced into it. It costs everything. But the people who do the work on the other side of it, they're different, better, more real. She looked at him one final time. I genuinely hope you're one of those people, Adrian. He held her gaze. Goodbye, she said. She walked down the corridor and she did not look back, and she felt, moving through the palace's outer halls into the afternoon light of the capital, the specific sensation of a weight she had been carrying for so long. She had incorporated it into her sense of herself, simply releasing. Not dramatically, not with the cathartic violence of something long delayed finally breaking loose, just quietly, the way a season changed, the way a door settled into its frame. She went back to Valwick 3 days later. The capital had more weeks of inquiry business ahead. Statements, documentation, the long procedural work of dismantling Veer's network properly, and she would return for it. But she needed 3 days. She needed the drive south through the hill country, the specific quality of the air as the capital receded and the land opened up, the way the light changed when you were far enough from the city that the sky was its own thing again rather than a backdrop. Thomas met her at the estate gate with the same weathered expression he brought to everything, which contained more information than most people communicated with full sentences. Vines are coming up strong, he said. North Field looks good. I know, she said. I knew they would. She walked the vineyard that evening in the long light of early summer. The vines that Thomas had said would not die easily were showing their second season of recovery, the green of them specific and alive in a way that still, even now, produced something in her chest that she didn't have a precise word for. The particular satisfaction of a living thing that had been returned to the conditions it needed and had responded. The evidence, tangible and root-bound, that attention and patience and the willingness to do the unglamorous work actually produced something. She had been right about that, about all of it. She stopped at the end of the north row and looked out at the hills, at the sky going amber and violet above them, at the estate that had been her grandmother's and was now hers in every sense of the word, legally, practically, personally. She thought about what the king had said, the trading charter, the commission's process, the formal recognition of something she had built from the wreckage of a marriage, in a year when she had nothing but time and necessity, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that surviving was not the same as living and that she intended to do both. She thought about Marin, who had made an enemy of Veer on her behalf and had not considered the cost worth discussing. She thought about Thomas, who had told her the rootstock was sound and had been right. She thought about Clara, sitting in that chair in Marin's sitting room, whose betrayal and whose redemption were both part of the same person, and both, she had decided, things she was going to hold without resolving into a simpler story. Life was not a simpler story. She had known that for a long time. What she had only recently learned was that the complexity was not the problem. The complexity was the texture of the real thing, and the real thing, in her experience, was considerably more interesting than the version that smoothed over the rough parts. She sat on the low stone wall at the vineyard's edge, and she let the evening come in around her, and she did not think about the next move, the next plan, the next careful calculation. She just sat. Mrs. Crane appeared eventually, the way Mrs. Crane always appeared when the moment was right, with a cup of tea and the specific expression of a woman who had been waiting for 3 years to see her charge simply sit in a garden without preparing for something. How bad was it? She asked. Bad enough, Seraphina said. And then survivable. And then something I would have chosen, I think, if I'd known it was coming, which is a strange thing to say about a year like this one. Mrs. Crane sat beside her on the wall. An unusual thing. She was not, in the ordinary run of their relationship, a sitting beside you kind of person. But the evening was warm, and the light was good, and something in the air between them had the quality of a thing that had been earned. Your grandmother would have enjoyed seeing this, Mrs. Crane said. I think she planned it, Seraphina said. I think she knew the estate would be the thing I needed. She just couldn't know when I would need it. She knew you, Mrs. Crane said. Quiet. Definitive. the specific certainty of someone who had watched 2 generations of the same woman. She knew you'd find your way here. Seraphina looked at the hills, at the vines, at the evidence of a year of work accumulated into something visible and growing and entirely hers. She had walked out of Blackthorne Hall 9 months ago with a ring left on a mantelpiece and a carriage already waiting and 5 years of careful survival in her body, and nothing else she could call her own. She had walked into this, into the vineyard and the ledger and the testimony and the king's receiving room and the corridor where she had said goodbye to a man she had married and no longer needed to be defined by. She had walked out of the life that had been designed around her and into the one she had built herself, in the dark, without anyone watching. That was the thing no one could take back. Not Veer, not Adrian, not 3 years of manufactured correspondence and poisoned trust. The woman she had become in the making of this year, that was not a position or a title or a relationship that could be dissolved or stripped or seized under administrative hold. It was simply her. She drank her tea. The hills went dark around the edges and the first stars appeared above the vineyard, and the valley settled into the specific quiet of a summer evening in the hill country. And Seraphina Vale sat in the garden of her grandmother's estate and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember the clean, unperformed sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had placed her here, because she had chosen it. And that freedom, the freedom of a life that belonged entirely to herself, was not a consolation prize for everything she had lost. It was the only prize that had ever been worth the winning.